Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining this latest Businesskeeper webinar together with our friends from Alvarez and Marsal in Brazil and from TK Elevator here in Spain. Compliance challenges for international companies in 2021, and there are many. Let me please introduce my fellow presenters. We have Judge Sergio Moro joining us from Alvarez and Marsal in Brazil, and Pia de la Cuesta from TK Elevator here, as I say, in Madrid. We're going to quickly go through some PowerPoint slides and some introductions, so I'll give each of the presenters the opportunity. So my name is Murray Granger. I am the country manager for Spain and Portugal for Businesskeeper, based here in our Madrid office. You've got some summary information there on the slide. I will let you read and we'll circulate the slides afterwards. Businesskeeper provides 5 compliance software solutions, mainly focused around whistleblowing, where we're the European market leader, our electronic secure application, the incident reporting. We've got the voice intake for the telephone solution, the case management for the secure books and records, third party for due diligence on business partners, and business approvals for approving and recording gifts, hospitality, conflict of interest, and so forth. We've been specialized in this business for 20 years as a German company, also with offices in Paris, here in Madrid and Lisbon. We're about 105 men and women, and we cover the public sector as well as all major business segments. And the news as of last weekend is that we are being acquired by EQS Group. So watch this space for more news on that development. Sergio, if I may hand over to you, sir, for your introduction.
Thank you, Murray. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me also thanks for being here with Pia de la Costa. I'm a manager director at Alvarez Marsal in the field of dispute and investigations, specializing in due diligence, internal corporate investigations, and compliance. Previously I worked as a judge, federal judge in Brazil for 22 years. I was the presiding judge of the Operation Car Wash, one of the biggest anti-corruption investigation in history. And now I joined the private sector, and I'm helping companies to do the right thing. Is that what I believe by this other side of the balcony, how people used to say. Alvarez Marsal is a consulting company with more than 5,000 professionals all over the world. We have offices in United States, Latin America, Europe, Asia, and we have a lot of capabilities, not only disputes and investigations, but regulatory risk advisory, transaction advisory, tax advisory, turnaround performance and valuation, for just to give an example. We have this team that in disputes investigation who could work together in a lot of capabilities. As I said, we are specialized in compliance, internal corporate investigations, and due diligence related with integrity and anti-corruption policies. Here we have some examples of the work that we do in Alvarez Marsal.
Thank you very much, Sergio. It's an honor to have you with us this afternoon. Let me move across to Pia, if I may.
Hello, everybody. My name is Pia de la Cuesta. I am the Regional Compliance Officer at TK Elevator for Europe, Africa, and Airport Solutions. As Marsal said at the beginning, I'm based in Madrid, and it's a pleasure to take part in this session together with Sergio Moro and Businesskeeper. TK Elevator is maybe you will probably know it by a decent group. This was our old brand until last summer. We are a German company which manufactures elevators, escalators, moving walks, passenger boarding bridges, and chairlifts. And we aim to provide innovative product solutions to improve the accessibility of cities and improve the mobility of people. So there you have some pictures of the products we manufacture and we can offer in the market, together with the installation and maintenance for all of them.
You've sent us such beautiful slides, Pia, that I feel we should go through them here.
Please go ahead.
This is the last one here, so thank you for these.
Thank you.
Okay. So, without further ado, let's move into the main part of the session: compliance challenges for international companies in 2021. The world is not what it was, and the future is not as it was supposed to be. Not my words. I heard this quote from a gentleman who many of you may know, Keith Darcy, formerly of the Ethics and Compliance Officer Association. But we have been through, and we continue to go through, a tumultuous phase in modern history with the COVID pandemic. I checked the numbers this afternoon, and I see that we have reached a total of close to 4 million deaths worldwide, of which 1 million are here in Europe. On a more positive note, I see that there have been a total of 177 million cases, of which 162 million people have recovered. So we can interpret the statistics more positively, particularly now that the vaccine rollout is underway, at least in certain countries. And of course, Sergio, we're very aware that Brazil has been hit very hard indeed, as has Peru and certain other Latin American countries. When we first started looking at this topic of the compliance challenges for this year, I must admit that I thought that after the evolution of compliance developments that we've had over many years, and we can kind of trace a timeline from FCPA through to the federal sentencing guidelines at the start of the 90s, to the Enron and WorldCom crises and the resulting Sarbanes-Oxley legislation, then through the financial crisis and Dodd-Frank, here in Europe, the UK Bribery Act, which was quite a milestone, the Sapin 2 laws in the French market, and then in terms of sort of, you know, the ethics, if not also the compliance, the Me Too movement a few years ago now. And of course, we've come into the EU Whistleblowing Directive, which is so central to Businesskeeper. But I was thinking beyond that with the pandemic, there didn't seem to be a lot of burning issues. I think now that is not the case. I think that's wrong. We've seen new supply chain laws coming in. Probably Germany is at the forefront of that, with a new law to pick up cases of human rights abuse or environmental abuse that kicks in 2023 for organizations with more than 3,000 people. We've seen a continuing momentum around modern slavery laws. I think the UK was one of the pioneers. Australia is very strong on that, as is Canada. The EU is moving on that. We are now seeing a draft directive for modern slavery, so those are quite closely connected. The major topic of corruption remains very important for compliance officers. We're now seeing movement in the United States. So after a few years where perhaps the perception was that the then president was not so keen on FCPA and on enforcement actions, although I think the numbers remained relatively high, we're seeing a new national security strategy under the Biden presidency, and we're seeing multilateralism being given renewed priority. So we can expect cooperation between enforcement authorities in different countries. Cyber remains extremely important, and even more so. We've seen the shutdown of the Colonial Pipeline in the United States with a ransomware attack. And we've seen in the communique issued at the end of the NATO summit a few days ago, they were highlighting how important cyber threats were for countries, but I think we know as well how important they are for corporates internationally as well. And they highlighted there that there's a new cyber center being opened in Portugal to help to address that threat. We're seeing also renewed waves of what I would call employee activism. So we're seeing companies being dragged into political issues in terms of voting right issues in the United States, in terms of movements like Black Lives Matter. So how, from a compliance perspective, do you react when your employees are wanting to express their views, as they're of course entitled to do, around hot political topics such as that? I noticed yesterday, after the Portugal football game in the European Championships, that at the press conference, Cristiano Ronaldo removed the Coca-Cola bottles of the main sponsor of the tournament and said, "Drink water," which very much accords with his own personal brand and his values, but not so much the corporate sponsorship dollars that have gone into that tournament. If that was a corporate setting, how would you react if one of your key employees was giving public messages which conflicted with the corporate messages where many budgets were coming from? So I think we have a constant challenge to identify what effective compliance looks like, to find the best practices and share them within the community of international compliance. The US guidance hasn't been updated now since June 2020, so it's been 12 months. It's been relatively stable, but that remains a key reference point. We've still got guidance relating to Sapin 2, relating to the UK Bribery Act, which I think still is a valid reference point. We've got equivalents with the 2016 Circular of the Fiscalia here in Spain. And we have more and more movements towards corporate defense of having effective compliance and corporate liability for companies and for directors, including in Portugal. Germany has a new law in that respect as well. So we're seeing some very encouraging developments from a compliance perspective, but there remain major challenges, and not least the ways of working under the current pandemic, with many people still working remotely, and some of the challenges that that throws up for compliance communications, behaviors, and also for investigations, of course. So without further ado, maybe I can address the first question to you, Pia, if I may. Could I ask you, what would be your top compliance challenge in 2021?
Well, I would say for me personally, working for this multinational company, the biggest challenge for the rest of 2021 would be how will we cope with the different legislations on corruption or on compliance we have in the different countries. So we have here in Spain, we have in Italy, we have in France, also in South America. We are seeing that increasingly more and more countries are enacting their own compliance or corruption laws. And it's been quite complicated to cope with all of them by having a corporate compliance program which has some common and clear rules. So in some instances, we are having to adapt our global compliance program. And this is not an easy task for us because, as you might know, being a German company, they like to have full control over laws and regulations, and it's not easy to make changes to global and common norms. So that's for me the biggest challenge. Without ignoring the biggest challenge, which for me is clear for the rest of the Europe, which is the implementation and transposition into national legislation of the European Whistleblowing Directive, which is clearly for me the biggest challenge, because as you might know, it will have to be transposed into national legislation by the end of this year.
So, Pia, if I may, maybe just one follow-up question there. Within TK Elevator, do you have a global compliance program that you then need to adapt for local specifics, or do you have a series of local compliance programs?
No, we do have just one global program, and in the case of Italy, for example, it was the first country which required some local adaptations. Then we had France with Loi Sapin 2, and also Spain. We also have some specifics, but no, it's just one global program, and that's the problem. That sometimes our global program does not meet the local requirements in terms of corruption or compliance laws.
And in those cases, do you make central modifications to the program, or do you have local additions to cover those legal risks?
It depends. It depends. For example, when it comes to the whistleblowing hotline, at that time, our whistleblowing hotline at the time only allowed for certain reports on the core compliance topics. For example, it did not allow reports on environmental issues or on tax issues or on social security offenses under Spanish law, for example. So we had to make some adaptations on that, and now we allow for every type of report. Then when it comes to a specific, for example, under Italian and Spanish law, it was required to do a criminal risk map, including all those offenses which could lead to corporate criminal liability. So in those cases, we did that just specifically for those countries, not for all of them, because that would mean a lot of work. But no, it was just something we did for the specific countries.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing. Sergio, maybe I can start by asking you the same open question, because clearly you're coming from a different jurisdiction and a different perspective. What would you see as your number one compliance challenge in your markets in 2021?
I will follow Pia Costa's opinion. I think nowadays it's a challenge to work with several jurisdictions. One thing that we need to realize is that we will have each day more international cooperation in criminal matters. We saw a lot of that in the past 10 years. And other thing, we are having a lot of extraterritorial jurisdiction, more cases using FCPA, for example, by United States authorities. But nowadays we also have the UK Bribery Act, and several countries all around the world are approving similar laws. During the car wash operation in Brazil, it have a lot of consequences in other countries in Latin America, in Africa, in all the region. And we saw some of these countries also approving similar laws, laws that establish a kind of criminal corporate liability for companies. And these laws could be also used to prosecute, for example, a foreign company who paid bribes in your country. So there is a lot of demand nowadays for compliance, for integrity in the corporate field, but you need also to realize that you need to deal with several standards from multiple jurisdictions. Usually we try to convince companies to think about the higher standards. The best way to face these challenges is to look for the higher standards. Of course, sometimes there is a problem of costs. If you are in a jurisdiction in a country that does not require so much, why you need to spend more money in your system, thinking about what could happen if you need to face something from other jurisdiction. But if you want to work globally, if you want to grow in this world, you need to think in a global way. So you could face, for example, we are seeing something, a lot of concerns, not about corruption, but not about integrity, but a lot of concerns about environmental controls. So if you want to sell your product in certain markets by exportation, you need also to comply with the standards, the demands of this country. And this will happen, I believe, in time, also with corruption and integrity. If you want to attract foreign investors for your company, you need to look for the higher stance. It's not enough to complying with the local standards. Of course, then you need sometimes to make some adaptations because even if you look for the higher standards, sometimes there are some specifics in the local jurisdiction that you need to attend. But maybe the best way to do that is to look for the higher standards. Anyway, as I said, sometimes there's the problem of the costs, and you need to convince your clients that that's the best option. Because it's not only about complying with the standards, but building strong and effective compliance systems to protect the company. That's the main point. It's not only about complying with the legislation, but protecting the company in the first moment. It's the best shield against frauds, against risks of being involved in something that you don't want your company to be involved.
So I think there's two different dimensions there. One is the market-driven compliance imperative, if I can call it that, where in order to be able to sell your goods into a certain market, you need to meet the requisite environmental standards, for example. Perhaps you need to demonstrate you don't have child labor in your supply chain. So you need to meet certain compliance standards. We've also seen, and I think around the Rio Olympics, there were some good examples of this, where in order to do business with the public sector, you as a private company had to demonstrate that you met certain standards in terms of being able to demonstrate proactively an effective compliance program. It's kind of easy to make the argument when there's a business case for it. In order to win this tender, we need to implement certain processes that we may not have had yesterday within the organization. But how much do you think that companies internationally are sufficiently focused on being proactive when it's not for a specific business case reason, but just in terms of doing the right thing and proactively being willing to invest?
I believe that there is an increased tendency of companies who want to work globally to do the right thing. You can look at the ESG movement. It's not only about complying with legislation and standards, but sometimes to have the leadership on certain matters, especially nowadays. I believe in terms of environmental policies, but also in other fields. Of course, when the legislation helps, when the public sector also helps to build an environment of integrity, this is better, because then the public sector and the private sector are in the same steps in the right direction. But sometimes, even if you have problems with the government, even when you have some lack of will from the legislators, if you are a company that wants to work globally, you need to think out of the box of the local jurisdiction. This is very important to companies to realize. And as I said, the main point is to convince, and I believe in that, the main purpose to have a strong compliance system, a one that is effective, is that it's a shield to protect your company, and this is good for the business. That's the main point. At the second point, you need to comply with the local legislation or the requirements from other countries if you want to make business on that country. I was a month ago. I read a news about a manager of a bank in a Caribbean island who was arrested, and he's facing FCPA charges in the United States because he was involved in a corruption scheme that was investigated in Operation Car Wash. Operation Car Wash in Brazil had consequences all around the world, and 3 years after that, they're still having problems with that. So a manager in Caribbean of a bank in Austria facing charges from FCPA in the United States because of investigation that started in Brazil. So there's a really new word in matters of corruption and anti-bribery. That's the reason I say it's an international trend.
I think that's a great example, and I've got a question for you about Operation Car Wash a little bit later. But Pia, I'd love to hear your perspective on whether you think that, in the main jurisdictions where you're active as a German company, but in Spain, in Italy, in some Latin American countries, you think there's a difference between people's motivation in the corporate actions that are being taken because they have to do it in order to do business, or because they are more forward thinking and they are focused on doing the right thing?
Unfortunately, it's the first option. So we are going after the sanction, and as you might know, ThyssenKrupp at the time was the protagonist of one of the 10 most important cartels in Europe, and that's why we started to set up a compliance program. And this is, I guess, at least in Europe, the main driver for companies to start implementing compliance programs. Now the national laws are also helping a lot, and best case is we have in Spain, where there was a boom for compliance officers 5 years ago when the criminal law was modified. But I see a slight difference, or I think I see a slight difference in Latin America, because even if not many countries have specific compliance or criminal jurisdictions, they are passionate for compliance. They love talking about compliance. They take initiatives on compliance very well. They are happy to have workshops on compliance, whilst it's not the case in Europe. Even if we have all these legislations which force us to have them, we are still seen as not as facilitators or enablers, but as sometimes blockers or people just questioning everything that we want to do. That's the reality. Let's hope this changes, but for that, I think it's key that compliance officers start thinking also in a strategic way, and start selling the compliance as something in the same way as we sell our products. I mean, products are important, technology is important, but integrity and how we do business is as important as that. So I think we, as compliance officers, we have to start thinking out of our comfort space, and get rid of this supporting function mode we have, and start thinking in a strategic way, how can we start selling our compliance in order to also provide benefits to our companies.
So very encouraging for our Latin American colleagues that they're the trailblazers with hearts and minds around, improving ethics and compliance, whereas in Europe, maybe on what you're saying, we have to be more forced to do it or heavily penalized if we don't. We're certainly seeing in Businesskeeper that the new directive for whistleblower protection, which comes into force by the 17th of December this year in all 27 EU member states, is really the game changer. But there you have a legal imperative that all companies, with more than 250 employees have to implement this year. And then there's a further 2-year implementation period for companies down to 50 employees. So we're beginning to see the draft laws coming through. I think we've seen about 8 or 9 European countries that have already published the draft laws that are already moving, but everybody will have to have that law in place. So it will impact all companies this year with more than 250, as well as the public sector and the financial sector. But that's a very clear legal imperative that companies have to have such systems in place, which clearly has a huge impact on the market and on practices within compliance programs. To realize that legacy systems which maybe were less effective, or companies who say, well, we have a system but nobody uses it, which of course doesn't mean that that's a good sign. On the contrary, it's rather a worrying sign, because there doesn't appear to be trust in the system, because the benchmark should be between 2 to 3 reports per 1,000 employees per year. But the legal imperative on that here in Europe has been absolutely crucial for the development in that area. But Pierre, I wanted to pick up on what you raised there in terms of thinking outside the box as compliance officers and really selling the program. So I guess you mean principally internally to fellow employees, but it could also be to other third parties outside the organization. Do we think that has an impact for the types of skills that are needed to be an effective compliance officer? In the sense that you don't need to be the best lawyer in the world. There's plenty of expert lawyers who can do the legal expertise. Maybe you need some different skills.
Absolutely. You raised a super interesting point, and I discuss this very frequently with my German colleagues, because they are so much focused on hiring lawyers for these functions. And I insist that we also need some IT experts, some marketing experts who are able to sell all our tools, all our processes, all the good we have. So yes, it's absolutely essential to not only internally, but I also meant externally. I remember a couple of months ago, I was contacted by my French colleagues, because for one of the most luxurious sport events in France, they needed to have, or one of the criteria to evaluate the companies which were tendering in a public bid, compliance was going to be considered. So all of a sudden they asked to please send me some slides on what is our compliance program about. And if you're not prepared for that, it's difficult to put something together which is nice to be seen by externals. So, and this is a reality. More and more we are seeing that public institutions, public administration are taking compliance into consideration when it comes to awarding public contracts. Mm-hmm. And I'm not talking only about having an ISO certification on a compliance management system, but they want to see that we are honest companies, that we have proper processes in place, etc. So it's absolutely essential that we start thinking on this, and we engage some marketing or strategic experts that can help us to sell our compliance programs, because typically lawyers are not the best sellers in the world. So to your question, yes, we should also open the box to some other specialists, not only lawyers.
Yeah, and the contradiction I see there is that at any compliance conference, if you ask the audience how many lawyers are in the room, 90% of the hands go up. But I see the tension there that perhaps a more progressive compliance team within an organization would not be centered around legal. You might have some legal experience in there, but I think you need a complementary set of skills. Internal audit is always excellent at understanding compliance processes. You need communication experts. You need people who are good at giving presentations. You need the investigation skills as well, which are not pure legal skills. That's much more process, and that's much more, in the wheelhouse of Sergio and his colleagues at Alvarez in terms of the investigation. So I think you need a broad church, as it were, within a compliance function. But I don't really see that happening so much. Certainly here in Europe. Sergio, is that also holding true for Latin America, or is there a little more diversity away from legal in your home markets?
I used to joke here in Alvarez, Marcel, that I'm proud of working with a lot of engineers by my side. Nothing against lawyers. I am a kind of lawyer. I work as a judge for a lifetime, and now I'm trained in legal issues, of course. So I give I'm not working as a lawyer, but I know the law and I use this knowledge in my work.
Mm-hmm.
But you need to have people from other fields of knowledge, like engineering. I was joking, but it's true. Because sometimes, for example, if you're doing compliance working in a compliance system for building construction company, industrial company, you need to have some knowledge about other fields, and sometimes you have the guy who has these skills in your side, by your side. You don't need to hire look for someone in other company. This helps a lot, and it's true that we use each day more technology to make the investigation, to capture the relevant data, to analyze this information. So you also need a lot of people from technology by your side, not only to work on the specific case, but to build tools that could make your job easier and fast from it was in the past. So you need to mix all these skills. One point that I would like also to say that in Brazil recently we have a new law that this new law brought some incentives for having compliance systems for companies who participate in public bidding process or with public contracts. It's still a little not that so much incentive, but it's a beginning. That is very good. But as we said before, in Latin America, there is some, at least in some countries, the private sector is a little bit detached from what's happening in the government. I'm seeing a lot of companies that want to build really compliance effective systems. In certain way, this also works for them in complicated jurisdiction as a shield against improper requests from public authorities. But it's true. Returning to your question, you need to have a mix of abilities. I'm a former judge. We have former police officers, but also we have engineers. We have people who know to make to look to the books, to the records, to the accounts, engineers, people from technology skills. The best result is when you have a mix of abilities in your team.
And Sergio, I believe the Petrobras Odebrecht judgments were now 2-3 years ago, and we talked a little bit about the kind of the ripple effect from those cases. We've got a question here relating specifically to Venezuela, but maybe if we can answer that in a more general context, in terms of the impact generally that those very high-profile cases of compliance failures, of corruption cases, of companies being penalized hundreds of millions of dollars, even billions of dollars in those cases, has in terms of, coming back to the title, the compliance challenges for companies in 2021, and I would even say beyond. Venezuela might be a good example, but there may be other Latin American countries and even beyond, even into the United States and into Europe, as a result of those very large cases. Have you seen examples of that from your perspective?
Kawash was a large investigation about bribery in not only being paid by local companies to public officials in Brazil, but during the investigation was also discovered that foreign companies paid bribes for these public officials in Brazil, and also it was discovered that some Brazilian companies paid bribes abroad for foreign public officials. Then you have bribes being paid in countries as different as Peru, Colombia, Mexico, Venezuela, just to stay in some examples. And they use it was used for this giant criminal scheme, and sometimes some sophistications tools to money launder the proceeds of the crime, and also to pay these bribes abroad, especially using financial systems in countries like United States, Switzerland, Monaco, Luxembourg, even in countries of Asia. So it was a international investigation in certain ways. Started in Brazil, but we would not be able to go so far if we didn't have the help of authorities of other countries. And later, also, we saw prosecution from other countries like United States, like Switzerland. I have just given an example. Some companies in Brazil need to settle charges before United States and before Switzerland. But the main point that is more interesting for me nowadays is to realize how it changed the business environment in some countries, at least, especially companies who started to have concern and make some investment in compliance systems. Some of these big companies who are involved in the bribery scheme, that's a shame, but at least some of them make the right decision to settle the case and then start to build strong compliance systems. There is some research in Brazil between some big companies, not all of course, not a small part of them involved in criminal schemes, but large research that shows an increase in the percentage of Brazilian companies who started to make investments in compliance during the car wash operation. And we have something that 50% to 90% of companies, just because of a criminal case. There are some influence from this international trend in favor of integrity. Of course, the new Brazilian law in 2013, the Clean Companies Act. But I believe the main cause was this criminal case, which had so much consequence, so many consequences, not only in Brazil, but all around the world. I read a very interesting paper written by a Brazilian that was a kind of game of mistakes that Brazilian companies make in their compliance systems that allowed the payment of bribes by their corporations. It's very interesting. It's a kind of manual about what you can never do.
What not to do.
What not to do.
Great, thank you very much. We're obviously getting some questions coming in on the chat, and I would very much encourage any of the attendees, if you have any doubts or comments or disagree on any points that you hear, please just jump into the chat. In the meantime, I mentioned earlier some of the increasing awareness around cyber risks. And to an extent, that falls within, in some organizations, the compliance officer's role in terms of the risk map for their organization. My sense is that it feels like many organizations are always playing catch up on cyber, and even the United States, recent around the election time late last year, revealed that there had been a systematic attack on US government cyber infrastructure that had been going on for a long period of time. So sometimes you discover that afterwards. But do we think that compliance teams are sufficiently aware of emerging cyber threats, or is that still seen as a niche area for the real experts?
I believe this is a challenge for everyone. For all companies, even for the private citizen, and we are still learning about the dimension of these threats. Of course, for the compliance teams in the companies, that is, we have more concern about what could happen. We are trying to provide the controls and the protection, but I believe there is a long way to go, and we are seeing companies that we always believe that had strong protection suffering attacks and showing that they are still vulnerable, and some of these companies had much more protection than the average of other companies. So there's a long way to go on this matter. But I believe there's an increasing concern about cyber threats in the market, in the company field.
And Pia, does cyber issues come into you in compliance, or are they dealt with elsewhere in TK Elevator?
No, they go to IT, and I think that's a pending matter to be tackled by compliance, because continuing with what I said before, we don't have IT experts on compliance. I think that would help to understand and to confront all those IT risks or security risks, especially now that we are, or most companies will implement home office, not due to COVID, but as a general rule. So I think we should focus a little bit more on IT issues, and we should also be more aware of what the problem might be. I have to admit, I am an absolute ignorant on IT topics, on phishing attacks, but I do see that due to COVID, or after COVID, or during COVID, we have had significant attempts of phishing in our company via different ways, through different mechanisms. But it was tremendous, the huge number of attempts we had during the pandemic, and still now we have, I would say, every other week we have some issues in this regard.
I'm sure. I think it's constant monitoring and alertness is required. There's a very interesting question that's been posted here in the chat as to whether compliance should be driven by companies or by the employees. That to me raises a very interesting concept about the responsibility for compliance in organizations. So when I've been training in organizations, I would always take the position that compliance is the responsibility of everybody working in the organization, not simply the responsibility of the compliance officers. When we used to go and give presentations in sort of remote locations, we wouldn't take the line, we're from headquarters, we're here to teach you about ethics and compliance. On the contrary, we would always take the view that, ethics and compliance is nothing new. You have your ethics here locally. You know how you do your business. You know what are the challenges that you face in your business, whether that's in terms of dealing with local suppliers, whether it's dealing with government officials who may expect facilitation payments, for example, or whatever the specific challenges you may be facing in your local workplace. So we always wanted to listen and learn from the local colleagues in a very humble way in order to be supportive of them for the compliance challenges that they face. So, we could almost frame the title of this webinar differently. So it's not so much the compliance challenges centrally directed, saying here's our top 5 list or top 10 list for the year, but more actually listening to colleagues and gathering what are the ethics and compliance challenges that they're facing. And I would always put sort of ethics in there as well, because a lot of this can be driven by the corporate culture, by the behaviors, by the willingness to speak up, which maybe wasn't there before. Perhaps Me Too is an example of that. Not so much legal non-compliance, but more sort of ethical concerns within the day-to-day business of the organization. Pia, is that something that you would echo from your experience in ThyssenKrupp and TK Elevator?
Absolutely. I guess that's indeed the risk of having two centralized compliance functions. That compliance is essentially carved out, and people may begin to view compliance as compliance risks as a matter of the compliance department. Mm-hmm. So I always encourage my colleagues to let business colleagues to participate in the drafting and review of our policies, codes of conduct, any sort of mechanism, tool, or process which affects the business directly. It's absolutely key to count on them, because otherwise we won't have their buy-in. And we will be seen as adversaries who just want to block the business. So yes, it's absolutely essential to include business colleagues. I mean, it's quite trendy to, for example, when it comes to review the code of conduct, to let employees to participate or say what are their main ideas or the main goals in that regard. The same when it comes to, we had, for example, TKE, the compliance principles, and they were set in a way that all employees had the chance to participate on that. So they were the ones saying, these are the principles I would like to abide by as a TKE employee. So those type of initiatives are very welcome and very well accepted by the employees, rather than corporate always telling them how they have to do things.
Sergio, is that something that you pick up on when you're advising clients on rolling out an effective compliance program?
The compliance program does not belong to the compliance officer. You need to have the cooperation of everyone in the company. This is very true, especially in banks, in anti-money laundering compliance. We are working with a bank, assisting a bank some weeks ago, and the compliance officers of the bank said to me something that I think reveals what it is. The manager, the person who will have the relations with the client, he is the first forefront against anything wrong. in the company against money laundering, using the bank to practice some kind of crime. That's true in every company. The compliance officer is there to give some guidance, to provide training, to build tools that will facilitate the work of everyone. But to have an effective compliance systems, you need the commitment of everyone from the top to the bottom. That's a difficult task because a lot of people think compliance is sometimes boring. Sometimes compliance brings difficulties to close business, to have profits. You need to convince everyone that this is a wrong thought. That's exactly the opposite. Compliance is there because it's good for the business, and then you need to convince everyone. But if the compliance officer is thinking that he will solve everything alone, he's already doing something wrong, because he'll not be able to do that. He needs to share the values of compliance with all people in the company, and it's not easy to do that, but that's his task.
Fully agree, and an aspect very dear to my heart is the effective whistleblowing piece as I described, the keystone of an effective compliance program, because that's where your informed and engaged people right across the organization have the chance to speak up in a trusted, secure way with no fear of retaliation, because everything you can do to reduce any concerns, any fear of retaliation, improves the effectiveness of your program. We have a question here about the slightly controversial topic of whistleblower rewards, where actually, although the perception is that this is very much North American driven because of the very high payouts from the SEC in the United States, there are actually many countries around the world, including here in Europe, who already have whistleblower rewards in place for denouncing public corruption, for reporting on tax fraud, and so forth. Within the EU Whistleblower Directive, it's been left open to the individual member states as to whether they wish to introduce such a system. I don't think in the first wave a great deal, a large number of countries will actually do so. But clearly, financial rewards are one of the great motivators for human beings. Therefore, my personal view, and I'm not speaking on behalf of Businesskeeper in this respect, is that actually that would be extremely effective at driving higher usage rates of corporate whistleblowing systems without even getting into cases of bad faith abuse, which are very, very small in reality, even though they do quite a lot of damage to the trust in the system. So I think financial rewards would be extremely helpful in encouraging people to come forward, not just in the North American model. But maybe before we just wrap up, you could comment from your perspectives as to whether you see whistleblowing rewards as positive or not, and whether in any of your jurisdictions you see any initiatives in that respect.
I would say I wouldn't discard rewards as one possible mechanism to foster whistleblowing, because at least in my experience, basically in Europe, I don't think member states or companies have sufficient protection mechanisms to prevent retaliation. And retaliation is not just firing the employee. Retaliation can also mean isolating the employee, or mobbing the employee, or making his life or her life miserable. I know a few examples of it, so I am quite in favor of at least opening the possibility to offer rewards in case effective protection of whistleblowers is not possible, because sometimes it's not possible.
Sergio, do you pay whistleblowers in Brazil? I forgot to say at the beginning, I worked after being a judge as a Minister of Justice in Brazil. And one of the bills that we approved was a bill that provide more protection against retaliation against whistleblowers. And also in this law, we made a general provision allowing the payment of rewards for a whistleblower. Unfortunately, it still lacks some regulation, but we were able to approve this. I'm totally in favor of rewards for whistleblower because as we know, sometimes there is retaliation, not so clear retaliation, but sometimes the life of whistleblower became miserable, and you need to do something about to not only incentive that someone be comfortable to make some report about wrongdoings, but in certain way you need a way to compensate this this kind of good behavior. Maybe it could be done by the government, like the US model, but maybe also the private sector could organize itself and build, even out of the government, some kind of reward for whistleblowers. One thing that's important to realize is that sometimes this fraud, bribery, this kind of criminal scheme, it's not only it's not only a crime against the government, against the people, but also it involved disloyal competition between companies. And that's what we saw a lot, for example, in some cases in Brazil, a company paying bribes to get a public contract instead of its concurrent. So for the market itself, they have interest to have a more fair environment for competition without some of them using criminal ways to do business. So maybe that could be a solution. Then you would not depend on laws or on government. Maybe companies could build a reward program. It's complicated to have inside their own company because who will judge them if some person it should be rewarded or not. Sometimes it's better to have this reward program out of the company, but you don't need to have this in a public institution. Maybe you could build this in a commercial association or something like that. But in resume, I'm totally in favor of reward for whistleblowers. We know that their lives sometimes became miserable because of retaliation. As I said, not crystal clear retaliation, but
very clear. Thank you. A fascinating perspective. We're out of time, but we've covered some excellent points there, which give us plenty of ideas for future Businesskeeper webinars. So thank you very much. We may well come back to you on some of these points for further detailed discussion in the future. Please let me say a very big thank you to both Pia and to Sergio for your time and for sharing your expertise with us here. Enormously appreciated. Thank you very much. We will be sending the PowerPoint to all of the attendees, and I'm sure that there's going to be some further questions. So if anybody who's still with us at this point does have any further questions, please do feel free to contact Sergio, Pia, or myself. more than happy to answer any other questions that you may have. So on that note, let me say thank you very much again. Thank you to all our attendees as well. I hope that it's been a valuable hour of your time. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Again.
Bye-bye.
It was a pleasure. Bye.
Thanks.